You ready? Ready? We're going to get started. All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to get started. I'm so excited to see again so many wonderful women here and men. But this is awesome. This is our Women in Communications Challenges and Opportunities session. It's sponsored by Cisco, and I have a wonderful group of great women panelists today that are going to talk about their experiences being a woman in the tech industry, and we will do a little Q&A, so if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we're going to try and save at least 10 minutes for that toward the end. But I'll kick things off, and I'd like to introduce the panel. I'm actually going to have them introduce themselves, but trust me, they all have amazing resumes, very impressive women, and I'm really excited to share their insight and experiences with you today. So I'd like to have everybody introduce themselves, and I think a great way to start the panel is to have them share a defining moment in their lives as women in a male-dominated industry. So, take it away.
Hey guys, Pegah, Ebrahimi. I'm 2 weeks into COO role for Cisco Collaboration. Prior to that, I was COO of Morgan Stanley's tech banking global franchise, and before that, I was CIO for Morgan Stanley for banking as well. So I've just come over from another male-dominated industry into tech. So I think defining moment for me as being a female leader has been about being really realizing that the best way you can showcase is really by adding impact. And through a lot of the roles I've done is I've really realized that the best way to actually bring down the walls of gender is just to show the impact you can have. And so I drive a lot of the way I think about management is how can I actually measure myself, because the numbers don't lie. And so if you're measuring yourself and the organization is measuring, it almost becomes a non-issue after a while. Like you feel like you're not held back because you're showing performance. And so I have realized that and really embraced how to both measure myself and measure organization for that reason.
Hi, I'm Jayme Bynum. I'm the Director of Infrastructure for SemGroup Corporation, which is a midstream energy company. So if I sit back and look at the defining moment, I think through my career, I probably had several, like most of you. We have moments in our career that changes the way we do things. But the one thing I think that started was an opportunity of enlightenment. It had been in my early 20s, in the early 90s. I was asked to manage a project that included getting a network out into a boat off the coast of Belize. Now, if you in communications, you understand that was a challenge in the 90s. And we were asked to create a platform that would allow still students to drive a remotely controlled underwater vehicle. I'm from the energy company. I know nothing about marine biology. So I can remember going into a meeting in Woods Hole Institute and walking out with the deer in the headlights in my eyes, saying, I really have no clue what I'm doing. And I had two choices. I could go back to my management and say, this isn't a project for me, I don't know what I'm doing. Or I could say, I'm going to figure it out. And so I gathered the network engineers, SCADA control developers, power builder developers around me, and we developed a platform that was very successful. So since then, all along, what I've always tried to remember is I have two choices. I say no, or I say, I don't know how to do that, but I will figure it out. And so from that point on, it's pushing myself to make sure that I make those opportunities for me and don't rely on someone else.
Hi, I'm Aruna Ravichandran. I've been here at Cisco for about 6 months now, but been in the tech industry for over 25 plus years. In order to share a defining moment in my career, I actually want to share a little bit of my life experience. So I started, I was born, raised in India, and growing up in India, my career path was actually chosen for me. when I was actually born by my mom. And so in India, growing up, I grew up as an engineer. So I have a bachelor's in computer science, came into the United States, got my master's in computer science from Santa Clara University. And by then I had two girls, and I was an engineering director at HP for about 10 years. Even while I was in engineering, I always loved the voice of the customer. So in my early 30s, when my girls were very young, I decided that I'm actually going to make a career switch and move to the marketing side. And that was a really hard decision to do, mainly given that I was doing really well as an engineering director at HP. And my family, though they were supportive, they thought, my entire family thought I'm actually going through midlife crisis, because you don't wake up one day and you decide that you're going to give up your amazing engineering career and move on to the marketing side. And the bigger challenge at the time was that at HP, I couldn't do a parallel move. I had to take a 3-level demotion in order to go from an engineering director to a product marketing manager. And so the defining moment for me was to basically go after the passion in my heart. And I made the switch from engineering onto the product marketing side, taking the 3-level demotion, not knowing how my life is actually going to turn out over the next couple of years. But fast forwarding on, I've been in the marketing side for almost 15 years now. And I can tell you that I'm absolutely passionate about what I do. I love the voice of the customer. I love being able to take the products which our amazing engineering teams actually build and create a passion for that in the industry across the board. So for me, it's about when you are passionate about something, there are, for every one yes, you'll hear 1,000 no's. It's about being able to follow through on what you actually believe in and making sure that you realize your passion and your dream.
Great.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lorrissa Horton, and I'm the VP GM for Webex Teams, Jabber, and our intelligence offering as part of collaboration. You'll see a lot of our great stuff over there. So I think similar to you, growing up, becoming an engineer was just is an automatic. My mom's a developer. My sister works for Amazon. She's also a developer. It was just kind of expected. But I think really the transition to becoming a leader was when I ended up working for a friend of mine who I had worked with in the past. And it was when I worked for him that he pushed me beyond a comfort level that I think most managers would be uncomfortable doing. But he knew what my potential was, and he knew what I was capable of. And it was so frequent that the things that he would assign me would make my, skin crawl and stomach turn, because I'm just like, I don't know if I can do this. And after going through, one after the other in terms of successes and actually completing that, it became less about questioning whether I could do it, because clearly I just have been doing it, and more about asking myself, why did I even question myself? It was almost odd that I was doing that. So I think for me, that was a huge turning point in going from just someone who was really good as an engineer and even just as a manager to really leading and executing team-wide initiatives and much larger experiences across a larger group of people. I think another part of that defining moment is not realizing how many people are watching or listening to what you're doing and saying, and acknowledging that, that is actually occurring. It was almost this disbelief that was the impact you can have when you're not even intentional about it. And I think working for a close friend helped me identify a lot of those things that maybe other managers aren't always comfortable telling you. And so I think that for me was a big pivotal moment.
Great. Well, as I mentioned, they all have really impressive resumes. You all worked your way into leadership positions, and that's really what I want to get at. Is what does it take? What does it require? What did you have to do to get into a leadership position?
I think, in my opinion, it's always do your best. I mean, number one, we're not going to get a leadership position because A, we're women, or we happen to be in the right place. You're going to have to be successful at what you do. You're going to have to perform. And with that, it is that opportunity of never saying no, always taking it and being willing. But then also, I think you also have to recognize that, and I think as women, we have a tendency to do this, of thinking, if we're going to do something, I'll take care of it. I will do it. At some point, you have to realize you can't do it all. And you do have to learn to rely on other people, and how you manage those other people and bring everybody motivated and get everybody moving forward to meet the same goal provides those opportunities. So in the end, I do think you have to be successful at what you do. You have to not shy away from the opportunities and then be able to rely on others as needed.
Yeah, I think another thing I would say is there's a different skill set to being just really good at your job. And it's kind of like table stakes. You got to be good at the stuff you do. But in order to also step up and really lead, I also think you need to inspire people, and you need to want actually your teams to want to push themselves and believe not just in your mission, but also in their capabilities. So I think I've been fortunate enough to have, great leaders and to learn from that. But I do think, and now I'm fortunate enough to have a female leader who's extremely inspirational and believes wholeheartedly that people are capable. Back to what you were saying, someone has to believe and you'll just go figure it out. And I do think you have to instill that. Now, it doesn't mean you just wishful thinking, so you have to put also the right people in place and all that stuff. But I do think that's the number one differentiator of a leader versus just someone who's really good at their job, which plenty of us, but you have to do both. Yeah.
So adding on to what both Pegah and Jayme said, I would say, being able to inspire your team is absolutely critical, without a doubt. But one of the key things which has also worked for me is that, we all were individual contributors at some point within our career, right? So being a leader is also to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk. So being able to roll up your sleeves, help your teams if they need to do that, going down to whatever layer within the team which is there, to be able to have that communications with them on a regular cadence and basis. Because I always believe that it's better to over communicate, because I remember when I was an engineer or when I was a product marketing manager, I used to double guess most of the time what was coming from the top. So being able to communicate constantly with the team, being able to help them regardless of what layer they are in, to make sure that they've understood the strategy, they've understood what is in front of them, I think is a big part of any role you actually have to do on the management side.
Yeah, I think you guys are hearing common themes across the board. The biggest part of being a leader, in my opinion, is, when I was a dev, the variables were the data coming in. Now my variables are people, right? So how do I get everyone aligned with a common goal, a common purpose, so that we all actually believe in what we're working on, as well as, I think, not just around motivation, but really understanding, like, what is the purpose that people believe they have, and what is the value that they believe they can deliver, and how do we strategically align people to work on the things that they're good at or that they love, because that's when you get a ton of this multiplier kind of factors across the board, because you end up with people who turns out like really love doing something and yet got assigned to, something that they hate. And you're not getting the velocity and the impact from them. It's taking the time to recognize the individuals in your organization and understanding everyone's strengths, everyone's weaknesses, and how do you guys come together as a team. I have a team right now of almost 500 people, and we're global across Galway, Shanghai, and all over the United States. And it is incredibly difficult to find FaceTime with all of them. But with all of our videoing and video meetings, I actually have built relationships with every one of them. I can tell you their kids' names, and I know what their husbands or wives do. And part of that is building the camaraderie and understanding that this is a person, they have goals, they have a life, and how do you best support them as well so that they can do the same for the rest of their organizations, and we create this all-up culture of how we're going to deliver together.
Great. All of you shared a little bit on your experience, and I'm just curious if you've observed, one of the things we talk about a lot is differences between the way that men lead and the way that women lead. And I'm curious if you've observed some of those differences and what your thoughts are, or if you don't think there's any differences.
One of the areas where I can personally relate between men and women, and I've tried to change that, is that most of the time, when you have a job in front of you, it's like if you have the skill sets for the job, as a woman, I'll always think about, I have to be a perfectionist. I have to have 100% of to be able to meet the job description in order to actually get the job done. But if you actually ask a guy, they probably will have 1/4 of the skill set in terms of being able to do the job, and they'll raise their hand and say, absolutely, I can do the job. So being able to, think that you don't have to be a perfectionist, being able to believe in yourself and saying that, yep, I'm willing to basically take the step up is one of the key areas which I've seen most of the women do. This is an area I constantly work on in terms of being able to say, yep, I can actually do the job.
I think Lorrissa hit on one factor, and I've worked with different age brackets of employees as well, and so for me, one of the things we always talk about, okay, what holds women back? And I do think one of the things that actually helps women and leaders when they do get in those positions is more and more people want leaders that have empathy. And in order to have empathy, it can't be fake. It can't be, oh, I only care about your personal life. So empathy doesn't mean that. It's actually leading with the mindset of what drives those people, the whole self, back to what Lorrissa said. What things do they care about? Because then you can actually figure out how to motivate them in the right way that actually aligns your organization and their objectives. So I do think, at least historically, the female leaders I've had have gravitated more to understanding that, because maybe that had a huge impact on them also developing. So because of that, it's kind of an advantage we innately have a little bit on over the whole.
I'll kind of piggyback on that a little bit. I think the studies show that there are differences between men and women and their leadership styles. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful not to stereotype that, because we all have our own style. But I think generally in my experience, and again, I do come from an oil and gas background, I do come from a very, very male-dominated environment, I do kind of believe that women tend to have a more nurturing role. And because of that, there is more empathy that you feel, or at least that is shared. It doesn't mean that men don't have that, but I don't think they communicate that in the same manner that we do as women.
I've had both, I think, positive and negative experiences with both male and female managers. And I think it's interesting, some of the female ones ended up almost worse than the male ones. And I tried to understand why that was the case. One of the things that I did notice in some of those cases was a lot of the women were looking to partner, which I think is great in terms of how do we partner together as a team. But then how are they leading instead of just partnering sometimes lacked. And I think that's where I saw a lot of women actually stall in terms of how far up the ladder, or where how high of an executive level they ended up. I think it is right that we are naturally empathetic, but we need to recognize when there's also someone that has to take the first step and take the risk and be the one who's willing to be held accountable. And that one, from the experience I've had, has been actually a challenge for even female leaders that I've worked for in the past. I've had equally empathetic male leaders that I've worked for. I have 2 young kids. I have an 18-month-old and a 4-year-old. And I've been building my career while being pregnant. I remember literally being in labor at the hospital, checking in on our things that were about to GA. And it takes really, I think, different leaders to be empathetic to that kind of situation, and be supportive in saying, look, you're in labor, maybe you should stop checking mail, but still be open to, like, I get it, you care about your team, you want to make sure you guys are all successful, so if you feel you need to do that, like, go ahead, right? Like, we will support you however we can. I think it's actually more identifying some of those qualities, regardless of male or female, that help support women actually grow in this type of industry. And those ones are a little bit rare and a little harder to find, but I do see a huge change in a lot of the male leaders in terms of building that same empathy and building that same understanding. So, I'm definitely hopeful because there's been a lot of positive change.
Lorrissa, I appreciate you sharing that story, and that's actually one of my other questions. And we kind of got a little bit. We had the women's luncheon yesterday. I know I recognized some faces. I know some of you were definitely there. We had talked a little bit about balancing the personal life and the professional, and it got a little heated. And I'm curious, so what are your thoughts on balance? You went through this pregnancy, being in labor, still working, checking your email. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah, so I get asked this question quite frequently. I guess a couple questions I get asked is like, how did you end up in your job at your age? Like super common. Second is like, you have a baby that you're still nursing. How are you traveling and doing all this stuff? It is incredibly difficult. I think the biggest challenge when I first became a mom was constantly balancing feeling like I'm not being a mom 100% and not being a professional 100%. And the reality is you don't have the time to do both at 100%. You need to find a balance that you're comfortable with, as well as need to be able to handle, I think, other people's criticisms of whether you're being a good enough mom or being a good enough professional. I think that honestly is the biggest challenge. Having a support system is huge. Both, my parents and my in-laws live in the same city as us, and that is a huge part of, it takes a village. I think, Pegah, you said this as well. It takes a village to raise children. In my case, it literally takes a village. I rely on that village. But it also, I think, takes creative thinking, right? I remember I joined Cisco actually about 10 months ago, and I was at the first Cisco Live here in Orlando. And I had with me a manual pump, an electric pump. I had, a cooler that I was shipping nightly so that my daughter was getting her milk every night. And it was crazy. I had 2 carry-ons I was pulling around with me in the conference. And people were like, why do you carry your luggage with you? I'm like, oh, it's not luggage. It's my pump and it's my cooler. And people were so uncomfortable when I would respond to them. And it's like, it's not my problem you're uncomfortable. I need to do my job. I need to be here. And my kid needs to eat. And I'm not going to apologize for that. And I think being comfortable to the point where you need to come up with creative solutions to make the situation work and not apologize for it, right? I think it is your right to be here. It is your right to be doing whatever job you've already earned. Do it however you need to get it done and don't apologize for it.
That's awesome.
I would say 100% agree. My girls are older, but I've gone through that stage when I was an engineer and as well as when I changed my career. I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old. But when I moved to marketing, I was traveling about 50% of the time. And it's very, very hard. And my girls were very young at the time. So 2 philosophies which I've always looked at in terms of my life is I outsourced everything other than, my kids and my husband, because those are 2 things which I can't outsource. So anything with respect to taking care of cooking, cleaning, key things which you have to do, those things I actually outsourced because that gave me the time, the quality time to spend the time with my family when I'm there at home. The second part was that regardless of where I traveled, always made sure. Now we have all of the video first technologies, which makes it much more easier to have a conference. Right? Regardless of where I am in the world, I have the opportunity to do a Webex call and have a conversation with my family. I have these amazing DX80 devices at home, and it feels like I'm talking to them face to face. But even during the earlier part, when there was no video technology, I always made sure that I would check in on a regular basis because you can't really continue to keep that conversations going when you're having such a busy life. So those are 2 things which I made sure I made time regardless of where I was in which particular geography, made sure that you have the time to have the conversation with your family members.
So the one thing I would add that's 2 things that are a little bit different than that. I also have two young kids, 3.5 and 10 months almost. And I do have a crazy support system, or it wouldn't be possible. But I would say 2 things as women, both in just work and leadership, that is important is everyone talks about balance. And to me, whether it was before kids or after kids, look, you're trying to balance even personal life, whether kids are in it or not, with work. And what I've learned is it's not balance on a day-to-day basis. It's really thinking about, okay, this week I'm traveling and I'm not there as much. It means it's balancing over a period of time. But in the next month, I'll make sure I use extra time to give back to the things that were neglected, where it's either sleep or other things. We balance all that stuff all the time. So I think one of the things that sometimes we get focused on is on a day basis. Okay, am I going to leave by X time so I can have that time? But to me, I'm like, I also get the luxury of being able to take a larger chunk of time off at times as well because of the position I'm in as well. And then the other thing I would say is, look, when I first was having my first child. I had kids pretty late. And when I was having my first child, I was like, shit, like I'm not going to feel like I'm giving enough to the job because I was like, I'm going to have to leave earlier, all this stuff. And what I realized is you just get really efficient, right? Because they're still paying you for the same amount of work. So you should vocalize this, because I started vocalizing. I said, look, maybe I'm in my head, and I was like questioning it to myself. And then I'm like, actually, I got done all the stuff I said I was going to get done this week, and it's still Wednesday. So it doesn't matter if I have to go take time off and go pump in the middle of the day. And I started taking less breaks, and you just get laser focused because you have to, because the list of stuff to do, whether it's personal or work, is not really changing. So I would say don't apologize for the hours either. That's why I'm back to the point that I made earlier. Learn to measure yourself so you don't doubt it either. You measure yourself across metrics, and you measure your teams. And if the measurements all say you're getting more productivity and you're doing great, like, don't worry about the types of measurements historically were in society, which is hours and, not taking days off and things like that.
There's really not much to add to what these ladies have said, because we've all gone through that balance. But let me kind of put it in this perspective. As a manager of employees, what does not work well with me is the lady that comes in and says at the last minute, oh, by the way, I'm taking off for the field trip tomorrow. It's like, okay, that's great. I want that balance, but plan it. A field trip's coming up. You cannot kind of throw that back at the business and say, but it's family life balance and I should do this. You're right. Family, in my opinion, is first. But there is a planning. You have to show your employer that you recognize that there's that balance. And because of that, it's not just a balance to you and your personal life. It's the balance back to the company. And this is how you're working through that.
I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought up that perspective. Lorrissa, another thing that you said earlier that you said about your support system. You need a support system. So I want to pivot a little bit and ask you, what are your thoughts on mentorship? Are you a mentor, or have you been mentored? And then what kind of value have you seen from that, your participation in that?
I absolutely believe that having a mentor plays a big role in your life. I've had male mentors, female mentors, even when I was an engineer. Even now, at my level, I still have a mentor, because you get a different perspective, which definitely plays a role in terms of shaping your ideas. You have someone who believes in you, who basically has the ability to counsel you, guide you when you need them the most, who also does not judge you, gives you that narrative and an input which is most needed, especially during tough times. So I've always had mentors. I'm myself mentor few people across the board. Don't have the time to do it a lot. I wish I did, but being able to give back from what I've actually received has been a big part of my life.
I've been also fortunate enough to have some great mentors. I say my first mentor was actually when I was 18 in high school. I was one of the only females in the entire district taking computer science. And I ended up on a board, a women in tech board, and a woman from IBM who until today, Lydia Sarasky, I met on the board or on the panel that we spoke in. And now 18 years later, I still go to her. We were actually just talking about perpetual licensing to recurring revenue and how do they do it in IBM and when do they do, it's really interesting, how long of a relationship I've had with that mentor. I've also had a lot of really strong, male mentors as well who give me a very different perspective than maybe how I'm looking at a situation or how I'm showing up. What are things that I could do to be more effective? And I think it needs to be someone that you respect and who you're willing to get very hard critical feedback from, because I think that's where it becomes very useful, is hearing the things that you may not be seeing, what are your blind spots? How did you think you came across as opposed to how did it actually land? And that, I think, shaped how I communicate and how I exert myself regardless of who I'm working with.
So I'm on an advisory board for the Oklahoma Women in Technology. And last year, we actually started a mentorship program for this organization. And what we found was outside of a corporate organization where there might be a corporate mentorship, when you broaden that out, women have a tendency not to ask for assistance. And the one thing that I would suggest kind of going forward, I think all of us need mentors. We've all had mentors, whether they've been formal or informal. But the one thing that I would recommend to anybody is you do need one. And if there is a woman or a man that you respect, don't hesitate to speak to that person and ask. Number one, when I'm asked, I mean, that's flattering. That really says a lot. So it makes me want to turn around and help you because you really complimented me. But on the other hand, it doesn't have to be difficult. And a lot of things that we have problems with is time. It's difficult to carve off that time, that once a week, hour with that person. But it doesn't have to be. It can be informal coffees. It can be informal lunches. But don't hesitate to reach out to somebody that you respect and ask if you can learn more from them.
I'm not going to say much more on that, except one just slight difference is sometimes you think of mentors as people who go through the same challenges as you. And I would urge you guys to also think about mentors that not someone that you directly necessarily report to, but someone also that can look at a different perspective. So that's why sometimes you could have great male mentors because they can tell you, hey, why aren't you doing X and why aren't you doing Y, and don't hold yourself back. So it doesn't have to be someone that resembles you the most. Sometimes it's just the most natural because it's just easier to connect. But that's the other thing I would say. Some of the best mentors I had, I don't relate to them on every front. I look for the areas where I can actually learn a ton because I don't do X as well as they do.
I just want to add the asking for a mentor. That was another thing that is super common is I have way more men asking me to mentor them regularly than women. And I think it's shocking that they're, out of anywhere. I will meet them at a conference once and they will send me an email or they'll find me on LinkedIn and ask for mentorship. Whereas when I look at the female ratio, it is just much smaller. And I think part of it is just, it's uncomfortable. And yet, why is it not uncomfortable for others to do it? And so that is one thing I think I definitely support. And second, I urge you, if you don't have one, find one and find someone you respect and just ask them, what is the worst that can happen? They're going to say, no, it's fine. You can find another one, right?
Sorry, while we're on the mentor topic, one other thing I would say that I wish someone had told me a lot earlier is in being in leadership, so much of it is also around branding. And I think one of the things women tend to, because you put your head down and you work and you're the results will just speak for themselves, which they do, but you also have to really think about also branding your accomplishments and all that stuff as well. And which is one of the reasons why I've historically had male mentors actually point that out and be like, how come you're not making this be your idea? How come you're giving all this, the feedback for it, but not really owning the branding around it? So that's the other thing I would just encourage you guys to seek out as well. Great.
Awesome. I'm kind of want to pivot again. I want to leave some time for Q&A, but I want to ask you guys another question. You've given a lot of feedback and kind of pull some ideas out of here already, but I'm curious what kind of patterns you've observed about women in the workplace, and maybe if there's something different they could be doing to better advance their careers. You just gave a great example. What other things can they do?
I would say, going back to the mentor conversation, find a mentor. If you admire someone, like Pegah said, it might not be in the same industry, it might not be in the same discipline. Take the courage, like she said, like the guys email her and ask her. You meet someone and that person blows your mind off about that particular person. Take the courage, ask the person whether they'll be your mentor. I've actually done that. There are some people who have said, yep, I'm happy to be your mentor, but people are busy and they've said no, and it's okay to say no. If you don't ask, you don't know whether the answer is going to be a yes or a no, right? So I would say, follow through on that, and that'll basically help you out quite a bit.
One of the things that I think I found in the women that I've mentored, a lot of the times they come to me is when, they're in a frustrating situation and there is a physical emotional response that they're very frustrated that this is happening, and they're frustrated that they don't feel like their male peers are dealing with the same thing. I actually think there's a lot of this that happens, but we've come to just accept it, right? Like we see cursing, we see slamming of doors, and like people don't respond to it the same way as someone crying. And all of those are just emotional responses. I think it's really important to self-assess and understand like when you are starting to feel that emotional response, if that's one of the ways that you do respond and you want to get under control. I had a great mentor, really talk about, do you realize that when you're starting to get upset or frustrated, you do these kinds of things? And having someone in the room who can recognize it helped me identify like what are those triggers where I'm moving from a productive conversation to one where clearly I'm not fully in control. And that helped me deal with all of these very confrontational situations, very adversarial people. Like it was just a really critical skill, I think, in being able to continue to move forward in a leadership area.
I would also add, don't be shy to share your accomplishments. That's one thing that as women, we're a little bit humble and don't want to speak out to what we have done. Share your accomplishments. You can still do that and recognize teams and recognize other people. But if you stop and really think about what you've done, it's probably not single-threaded. You probably are very multi-threaded in that, whether it be organizational, project management, technical development, team leadership, whatever it may be. And you should sit back, reflect on that, recognize it, and don't be hesitant to share it.
I guess we've touched on a number of them, but I would love to open it up to questions and figure out what you guys want to talk about.
Yeah, do we have any audience questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I think
maybe repeat the question.
We'll repeat the question. So the question was basically the having to feel like you have to be at 120% and make excuses and rationalize even to yourself why, hey, I have to do this thing that's important for family, or the example that Lorrissa made around going into labor. Of course it's a challenge, right? I do think back to your point, I don't think it leaves you, but I do think the number one step is for you to realize for yourself, because there's sometimes even a doubt of, hey, I'm measured on the amount of time, or I'm measured at how quickly I respond to this email, not necessarily if it's actually a response that gets a resolution. So what I've really tried to do is more focus on, and part of it is I'm COO, so maybe it's easier to do that in my role, but I actually do think I try to focus on outcomes and really manage outcomes versus trying to think of myself as involved in the process. So if you're thinking about the outcome, it doesn't matter if it took 10 steps to get to the outcome that actually matters for the business versus 2 steps, or it doesn't matter. And yes, the full scale and time frame of how you got to the outcome matters, but it doesn't matter the fact that I responded to the email, let's say within a minute, and now put it on someone else's corner, but it doesn't actually get to the outcome. So back to my point, and I know it feels like it's a thread, but I guess that's why they made me COO, is I do really think you should measure yourself on impact and outcome, and also try to reframe that for your own self as well, versus measured through the typical things that historically were, which is hours, or the number of people who report into you, or the exact salary, or all these measurements that don't actually long-term make you a good leader. And if you focus on the outcomes and impact, it actually drives you closer to leadership roles.
I would add to this, in reality, we've got tasks to get done. And that's when we kind of get into that mode of, I have to do it at all costs. And I would really encourage you to step back and look at that task that has to be done in an analytical way, and how other ways can I do that. There's other ways of accomplishing the same goal without hindering other things in your life. And in the end, as long as you meet that goal in the end, you can probably find that balance.
I think we have a few more minutes left. Does anybody has any other questions? If you have questions, it'll be great if you can come to the mic and ask the questions.
All right, we've got a taker.
So I've been in IT about 25 years, right? And I'm a technical leader, not a management leader. My struggle is usually as soon as you talk to someone, they automatically assume you don't know what you're doing, right? I can have a junior person with me in the conversation who's a male, and they'll assume that that person knows more than I do. And I get an emotional response out of that, right? So I'm trying to figure out how to deal with that. Some of it is, well, that's their problem. And I was trying to do that more, but any advice on that would be great.
Great question.
So I actually had that exact experience yesterday, which was really funny because we did a customer meeting and I had my chief of staff with me, and he is a white male. And, you know, the customer came in and looked directly at him and introduced themselves and talked about what they do and what their role was. And someone else in the room was like, so maybe we should do some introductions. And, you know, he introduced himself as my chief of staff. And it was interesting because then instantly it was like, oh, I'm sorry. Let me completely change my body language. I think it's obviously natural to have an emotional reaction to that. I definitely, I think, have gone to the point where I don't take it personally. I think, you know, when people show up in some of these situations, they're trying to make the best impression that they can. And it is unfortunate that their initial assumption was the white male next to me was the leader in the entire room and didn't even account for, you know, even looking in that area. But I think, you know, having folks in the room who just step back and say like, okay, clearly that was an error. Like, let's just step back, have the conversation of introduction so we can recognize who's there. That moment was almost a like, let's do a gut check, everyone. Like, this is what just happened. And each time that happens, I think people reset their expectations, right? And so as long as we can try and find opportunities to help reset that norm and that understanding, I'm hoping we'll get there. But I think it's not surprising to have an emotional reaction to that.
So I would say, definitely. I do think it's like that. Look, I'm like an immigrant and a woman. So sometimes whenever you have diversity, it's just natural brain cells think in the typical way they're used to seeing it, right? But tactically, what I would say is try to not be emotional, and you can do it two ways. One of it is preempted in your head, right? So you don't wait for people to make the assumptions, and maybe you have to set the groundwork for that meeting and you are starting the conversation versus letting it be that direction, especially on sometimes that happens internally, right? Like the more leader is looking at the person who's in your team or someone else that doesn't have as much knowledge, and they'll start answering it, right? And then the second other tactical thing I would say is sometimes you have to take the emotions out of it, but sometimes don't be afraid to interject and also express disagreement if you actually disagree. Because there's been situations, especially earlier in my career, where someone else that has less knowledge starts talking about it, but I don't want to show them up and make them feel stupid in the meeting, so I'll just reserve it and then be frustrated that the person wasn't looking at me. But if you actually have good points to make and you definitely remove your emotions from it, but make the points, you're actually shifting the way the people in that room perceive you for next time as well. So those are more like tactical ways.
So give both Lorrissa and Pegah hit it right on the spot. In my case, I have two things which I actually have to deal with. One is being a woman. The second is automatically people will dismiss marketing as the creative part, right? So when I walk into the room, they'll be like, oh, she's the marketing girl. She probably does not know technology. And so half the time, you know, when I walk into the room, doesn't matter what title I have, it's like the marketing person does not know technology and they can't really talk about this particular areas. So the thing which has actually worked for me is very close to what Pegah actually said. It's about bringing the conversation and establishing that you know you're a subject matter expert in that particular area. You don't have to do it in a, if you have to interject, I actually interject in a not in a direct way, but I'll basically bring the topic into the conversation so that I can establish a subject matter expertise in that particular area. So the person actually knows that I'm actually talking about an area which resonates with them. So that is the most important part. You can do it directly or you can do it tactfully by bringing the conversation home.
All right. Sorry, one other more tactical thing. The other thing I would say is build out either your elevator pitch, back to what you were talking about branding and taking credit, and a really good bio. And actually, maybe you need to have your assistant be proactive and actually share it with people so people know your credentials. Hey, did computer science, or I went to MIT, or all these things. It's like you have to also brand yourself and go against the perception people have, and it might mean a little bit more proactivity as well.
Okay, so not to harp on this, but I want to look at this a little different perspective. Being on the customer end, it's very common I have all network engineers that are men, data center engineers that are men. So when the vendor comes in and sits down and they start directing the conversation to these guys, stand your ground. Continue to ask your questions. If they continue to talk around you, there's a couple of things that I've done in the past. I've made it very clear by picking up the phone and saying I will not let them back in my office. There's a point there that you have to lay the groundwork. If it's internal customers, again, I work for oil and gas. We deal with I&E techs out of the field all the time. They really don't think that I've got the knowledge. Then you have to make that extra effort to develop relationships. So you allow that meeting because you've got to have the outcome of the meeting needs to be the best thing for the company. But that doesn't mean you don't walk out of that meeting and you head upstairs and you sit down and you develop a relationship so they do recognize what your skills and your knowledge really are.
I think we have time for one more question. Do you want to come up to the mic, please? Yeah. I'm not sure it'll...
Hello. I want to make sure you can hear me. It's a noise out here, but a lot of you have already touched on this, and it's about speaking out and making yourself visible. But I know me, throughout my career, I've made myself very invisible. So I wonder if you have any advice for us, any of us who have been invisible and we want to be more visible.
Aruna knows a lot about this, so she can tell you the big picture. I'll do my micro stuff that I've done, or I've realized I don't do and I started doing, is back to what you were saying about taking credit. Sometimes if you're actually invisible and you don't want to go to the extreme of really making yourself known and creating this brand for yourself, just at least make sure the accomplishments you're doing on a day-to-day or month-to-month are known. And so sometimes it means, hey, it's obvious that I got this and I shipped this out, but maybe I need to actually spend some time and craft a message and let some of the leaders know and its impact. And it can't just be broadcasting, but I do think most women they're on the spectrum of branding and taking credit. They're here. So you should never, if you're over here on this extreme of light, you should not question the fact that you're really going to overshoot. You're never going to be the type that takes too much credit. We all hate someone who takes credit for stuff they don't do. So if you're on this spectrum, just know that even if you overshoot, you're never going to get to the site of the place none of us want to be, which is taking credit for other people's work. So I would say at least own the things you've done and figure out how to get awareness around that.
So the other one I would say, being in marketing, is brand yourself, right? So we have so many different social forms in terms of being able to brand yourself. It doesn't matter whether you're an engineer, you're in IT, whether you're in accounting, whether you're in finance. We have an amazing social world. When I say social world, the social professional world. All of us, I would say most of us, could probably have Facebook profiles. But being able to be out there on LinkedIn, being out there on Twitter, being able to talk about your ideas, being able to brand yourself should become a big part of where you invest in yourself. If you don't invest in yourself, nobody is actually going to invest in you. And so being able to get your word out about your thought process. So just start with something small. I give this counseling always to our sales teams, is that, if you're working in accounting, doesn't matter which discipline you're working in, the tech career, on your product set, take 2 minutes within the day to basically put something out on LinkedIn, on your LinkedIn profile. Or if you don't have a Twitter profile, walk out of this meeting, go create a Twitter profile. all of the EC conversations are actually being looked at on EC19 or on the Cisco Collab site, Cisco Collab EC19. Go write a tweet. Talk about this women in tech. Be established, establish yourself. And the other thing to do is follow other different leaders in the market, follow other technologists in the market. Look at all of the blogs they actually write and be able to share the blogs. If you don't have something to say, look at what other people have to say, share that, and before you realize it, that gets actually viral and people will actually get to know you. So being able to externally brand yourself is a big part of being able to establish your own persona, both internally as well as externally.
All right, we are actually out of time. So I would like to help me, join me welcoming my panel, thanking my panel. You guys have been fantastic. And I really appreciate you sharing with everybody today. And thank you all for joining for this.